Jon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Seth. Really great to meet you, and nice to see you again, Jonathan.
You as well.
Yeah. So let me go ahead and start off. You're a pioneer of an online community of self-identified ex-vangelicals. So Jon, can you give us a bit of a sense of what that term even means? Because I'm sure some of our audience has no idea what that is.
Yeah, I did not help popularize the term at all, but basically it refers to, I think, anyone who used to be part of a conservative evangelical church context, a fundamentalist context, and who no longer participates in that tradition, who no longer identifies in that way. So a lot of times the journey out of a tradition is really difficult. Sometimes it's not, but often you're talking about the loss of beliefs, the loss of important relationships. So it can be a really difficult time in life, and a lot of spiritual trauma is something that people are talking about a lot now. So we formed a community to create space for those who are dealing with those wounds, the past hurt from their church experiences. Some folks who are ex-evangelical are done with faith, they're done with church, they don't want anything to do with it. That's their own journey. But some of the folks leaving these traditions still care about their faith in Jesus. They still want to believe, they want to have spiritual practices. They don't know how to do that, though, outside of the tradition they've always known that they used to be a part of. So ex-evangelical more broadly can mean pretty much anyone who has left these kind of traditions in any direction. Whereas at Harbor, we are mostly folks who still identify with faith and Christianity in some way, but who have left that particular expression of Christian faith.
Awesome. Well, evangelical is kind of one of those broad terms that can mean everything and nothing at the same time. So before we kind of say too much about ex-vangelicals, let's talk a bit about what they are ex. What do you think evangelicalism is?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of people have tried to answer it, and there are some different ways you can answer it. I view evangelicalism as a particular strand of Christianity, primarily in the West, and it is largely non-denominational in nature in the US, though there are certainly denominational churches and traditions that would fall under the umbrella of evangelical Christianity. I personally view its roots, modern evangelicalism, its roots back in Whitefield and the awakenings on the continent of the U.S. And of course, then there's like a modern phase that Billy Graham helped to kick off, sort of reclaiming the word evangelical. But yeah, I would say anyone in any Christian tradition that theologically fits within certain parameters, I would describe their faith as more evangelical in nature. Those parameters, there are plenty of ways you could try to spell them out. A guy named David Bebbington is a historian. He came up with something that is now called the Bebbington Quadrilateral. He describes what he sees as the 4 pillars of evangelical Christianity. In my own words, these 4 pillars, if I remember them, are the Bible, particular views about the Bible, atonement and the cross, particular views of that, conversion, a heavy emphasis on individual personal decisions for salvation, and activism is what he calls it, but like primarily evangelism and missions. So I would say any expression of the Christian faith that fits in within those 4 parameters is theologically what I would call evangelical Christianity. That's my best stab, with compliments to David Bebbington. Oh, and I'll add this. A historian who's working now, Peter Choi, has suggested we might need to add a 5th or a 6th pillar to really capture the picture. And he suggests words like imperialism or chauvinism. And I think Peter doesn't mean this really polemically. I think he means it historically, that if you look at the history of the movement that Whitefield started, it is marked by a posture of chauvinism, which my understanding of that is the idea that, you know, as soon as Whitefield is emphasizing personal conversion, you're splitting everyone immediately into the goat and the sheep. Right? You have the people who have had the second birth, the people who have had the conversion experience, and then you have those who haven't, even though they're churchgoers, even though they would say they believe in Jesus. And so you immediately have this one up, one down relationship being formed. And I think that thread goes all the way through all the expressions of evangelicalism. And the idea is that we have this belief system, we have this worldview. It's a popular word, I think, among evangelicals. And the assumption is that anytime anyone disagrees with any part of this worldview, it's taken for granted that I am correct and the other person is incorrect. And furthermore, it's incumbent on me to then share the goodness I have with them. They need what I've got. So I then have to persuade or enlighten the other person who's lacking the key thing that I have, which is a correct worldview. And so that is why I think that's always been part of evangelical faith. It's part of the problematic nature, in my opinion, of that tradition. And so that is why I think Peter Choi is saying that those are the kind of words we also need to use if we're going to describe evangelical Christianity.
I think that's really interesting because I have my own issues with contemporary evangelicalism, but I've tended to be quite a big fan of the tradition and history of evangelicalism. But you're kind of making a bigger claim than just, American evangelicalism has gone off the rails. You're saying historic evangelicalism is tainted in its foundational roots. And so it's not like we need to redeem this tradition. You think we just need to push it aside and kind of start again. Is that where you would go with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think any faith tradition that anyone wants to participate in, they should critique and they should be humble and they should say, we've probably gotten a lot of things wrong. Let's figure out together what's gone wrong and let's try to fix it. So I think that is true of evangelicalism, and it's true of every other religion and every other branch of Christianity. So, yeah, but I do think the problems with evangelicalism go way, way back. Like if you look at Whitefield, I'm not a Whitefield scholar, but I read a biography of him, right? And one of the points of Stout's biography of him, one of the famous ones, one of the points he makes is that Whitefield basically pioneered the commodification of religion in the US. What had been a very communal, neighborhood-based endeavor before now became a product that was finally honed to reach particular markets. And then the marketplace of religion took off from the day of Whitefield on. So I do think a lot of the way we understand church, we owe, for better or for worse, to the awakenings. And I think that I would say some of those legacies of Whitefield's preaching are pretty problematic. Yeah.
If I could return back to this point you made about David Choi, about imperialism, I believe was the term you used, and chauvinism. That definitely does seem to be a marker of evangelicalism, but it also struck me as it seems to be an aspect of most religious movements that it is a sort of in-group, out-group. So I just want to ask you, is there something particular that Choi is saying about evangelicalism that maybe goes beyond or is slightly distinct from other religious movements?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can't speak for Peter Choi, but I would say that yes, every religious movement has boundaries that are helpful to distinguish who's part of the tradition and who is not, who's part of this particular community and who is not. But not every religious tradition says, oh yeah, and all those who are outside need to be inside. So we're going to go to them and convince them to be part of this group we are a part of. I think that's pretty distinctly evangelical. Now, you could point to other things that we might not label as evangelical Christianity, Mormonism, Christian Science. You might be able to point to different Jehovah's Witnesses. There might be other traditions out there that also have a missionary impulse. But I think the kind of imperial world conquering motive that seems to be powering evangelicalism is somewhat unique to evangelical Christianity.
I can imagine sort of an evangelical at home listening to this and thinking, well, is that specific to evangelical Christianity or is that just Christianity? And they would, think of the Great Commission and evangelism and Paul's journeys to spread the gospel. Is there a way that you see that evangelicalism is doing something above and beyond what just sort of historic Christianity is doing in that regard?
Well, if you talk about historic Christianity before Whitefield, you are looking at colonialism. You are looking at the Portuguese church going hand in hand in lockstep with the conquerors who went to other cultures and enslaved people. So yes, I would say there have been problems with missionary work in the church that far precede Western US evangelical Christianity. But yeah, I mean, sorry, can we edit out this? Can we edit out this part? I lost my way.
Oh no, I want to
have-
keep this. This is the best part. This is the best part.
This is the best part. When the guest loses his mind on live interview, we all love it.
Here's the thing. Yeah, if you ever need that and it's a long break, those all magically disappear in the final product.
Oh, but I love this. This is so human.
We can leave in. I'm sure there'll be plenty of human moments that aren't me just completely forgetting what I was going to say. I would say this, Jonathan, about mission work in the Christian tradition that isn't particularly evangelical. I take my cues on mission work largely from Leslie Newbegin, famous missiologist, and there's also some Asian missiologists who've done really good work. Shoki Ko is one of them, and they just have other models that are different from going in, convincing other people that they're going to hell and they're wrong, and they need to believe the same thing you believe in the same way you believe it. There are more mutual models of mission work where you go into a new context and you share the treasures of your Christian faith with that context. You allow them to interpret that faith in their own contextual way. Meanwhile, you open yourself up to receive the treasures from their culture, their faith tradition, and you both become converted in some way, right? The experience changes both of you, hopefully for the better. Hopefully you're drawn closer to God, you through their faith tradition and them through your faith tradition. So that to me is a much healthier version of mission work that I tend to see more in the mainline Protestant modern missionary movement rather than in the conservative evangelical mission movement.
So I'm sure with this whole ex-vangelical thing, we can talk about it in the abstract, but for most of the people probably in your own congregation, this is more of a personal journey. And I'd really like to touch on that a bit, if you're okay talking about it. What was your own journey from evangelical to ex-vangelical?
Yeah, thank you, Seth. I was just a card-carrying evangelical. I mean, I was all in, professional evangelical. I did about 6 years doing mission. I was a missionary legally. I did campus ministry, but the way that parachurch organizations work, I was employed as a missionary, but my mission field was college campuses in the US. So I did that for about 6 years. And then I worked at a large church for about 6 years, multi-site evangelical church in the Pittsburgh, PA area. And I loved it. I mean, my first 6 or 7 years, I really enjoyed the ministry. I was totally sold out on the belief system and the practices. 100% tried and true believer. A lot of things happened slowly and then rapidly to make me realize I needed to leave the tradition. One was I started to form relationships with people who were just different from me. So for the first time in my life, I mean, I'm embarrassed that this happened for the first time when I was a full-fledged adult, but for the first time in my life, I had Black friends who were actually talking to me about what it's like to be Black in the US. And I was listening to them. And as things were happening on the national stage, Michael Brown, George Floyd, I was hearing firsthand from them how it affected their bodies and their minds and their spirits. That changed my entire view of race. I also became friends with feminists, right? Why did it take me 26 years to become friends with feminists? I don't know, but they started to talk to me a lot about gender. And the women who are feminists were telling me, again, what it was like to be a woman in the US. The same goes for LGBTQ folks. And my sister came out during this time as well, as a lesbian. And so as I'm just doing life alongside and with people who are very different from me, who are having a very different experience moving through the world in our society, I just realized my church, I no longer really viewed society the way that my church viewed it. And the fact that my church would not ordain women, the fact that my church would not really countenance any queer people doing anything other than just attending a worship service and giving tithe monies to the church. The fact that we had 99% white people in this massive church in a city with plenty of racial diversity, though segregated by neighborhood like most US cities, still plenty of people of color in the greater Pittsburgh area. So our response to police killings of young brown and Black people was unbelievable to me. We would just pray for everyone involved. We'd pray for the police officers and their families. And I was appalled by a lot of it. So that was the main thing. I was in a long ordination process that was just unique to that church. As an independent church, I just only would have been ordained for that particular church. But the process was long and dragged out. And at the end of it, after years in this process, they finally, mysteriously at the 11th hour, questions of sexuality came up. And they basically said, can you sign off on the statement, homosexuality is a sin? And I said, no, I can't sign off on it. And furthermore, I have some questions for you about this, because there was so much inconsistency, so much ignorance in the church staff and policies, such that there were, about how to actually minister to queer people who were in the congregation. And so I asked them all these questions. What are we doing? What are we actually doing with the very real queer people who go to our church for whatever reason? They found a home at our church. And what are we doing with them? And they couldn't answer any of my questions. They were not hard questions either, really. I mean, they were pretty straightforward. I asked them, we had at the time, a married lesbian couple who had kids coming to church every week, putting their kids in the kids' church, volunteering to the extent we let them volunteer. And I said, what is our hope for them? 5 years from now, 10 years from now, say they're still a part of our church. What do we want to be true of their life, of their marriage? Do we want them to be divorced at that point? Though divorce is spoken against way more often in the New Testament than, say, homosexuality, is that what we want for them? Do we want a celibate marriage? What's the end game here? And the church leaders had no answer. They just had no answer. Like, well, we just have to pray about it. Okay, well, that's not giving a lot of pastoral guidance to the large staff of pastors and other ministers who work at this church and who are actually trying to walk alongside and care for these folks. So anyway, that's a little bit of what precipitated my exit from that church and that tradition.
You go, Jon.
We'll edit that out. Thanks for sharing that personal side of things. A lot of the stuff you were talking about there was, that's happening a lot around the time that the political divide is really intensifying and Trump is coming on the scene. And my sense is I didn't really hear much about ex-vangelical communities until around this sort of Trump era. How has the political sphere played into the rise of ex-vangelical communities?
Well, I think if you look at ex-evangelical communities, not Harbor Online community, but just more broadly, they exist on social media, and they are, again, people who have left the church entirely. And mixed into that are a few folks who still maybe are holding on to faith, progressive faith. So that the only thing tying together those kind of groups are, we're not evangelical anymore. That's pretty much the common thread. Now, what tends to happen in those groups, because I've been a part of some of those groups as well, they tend to be very progressive politically. And I would say being opposed to Donald Trump, for instance, is one of the absolute unquestioned agreements that everyone in those spaces has. Like if you stumble into one of those somehow with some pro-Trump message to share with the group, I pity you. Hell, you will experience the fury of hell. So you don't want to do that. Now at Harbor, it's a little different because we have more in common than just we're not evangelical anymore. We're a faith community. We read scripture together. We talk about it. We care a lot about Jesus and what it means to follow Jesus. So we have a lot more commonalities. I would still say you can't find a Trump supporter in our community, try as you might. But we're not talking about particular candidates in our gatherings for multiple reasons. But yeah, I would say Trumpism certainly intensified this ex-evangelical movement. I don't think it's solely responsible for it. I think people were starting to question things and starting to break away from evangelical churches for a while. But I certainly think 81% of white evangelicals or something voting for Trump in the 2016 election, something like that. I think that horrified a lot of folks who saw him as one of the most despicable public figures of their lifetimes. And it's hard to compute if this is the correct worldview, the correct faith that has a monopoly on spiritual truth with a capital T. Why are they the ones overwhelmingly supporting this monster for public office? So I do think that the political scene in the US has definitely played a role in sort of intensifying the ex-evangelical movement.
I don't want this question to come across too pointed, but it is something that's arising in my head, and I think it will for some of our listeners, which is it healthy? I know you said at Harbor you guys are now more about things that I know you said that you at Harbor are more united than just what you used to be. But is it healthy for a movement to be grounded fundamentally in what it opposes rather than what unites them? Especially a movement that's supposed to be grounded in inclusivity and accepting everyone. It just seems like these are two things that I'm wrestling with in the back of my head, and I'm sure some of our listeners might be as well.
Yeah, well, I think I more or less agree with you. I think if you go to these Facebook groups that are just ex-evangelical, that's the only uniting thread. I think they're mostly anger. Mostly those groups are angry. Now, I don't think anger is a boogeyman that we need to like run away from. It's good that people have those outlets to express their anger. I think it's healthy, frankly, but just for what it is. It's an outlet to release your anger, to receive some validation that you're not the one who's wrong. When you were hurt by a church community that did something bad to you, they were the ones who were wrong, not you. You need to get outside your church community sometimes to hear that from other folks. So I think it serves its purpose, these pure ex-evangelical spaces online. But I don't think it would be hard for me, I'll say, to actually build meaningful community in those spaces that are solely united around what we're not and what we used to be, but now we reject it. So that's why I'm glad Harbor is more than that. I mean, it does do a lot of that sort of faith deconstruction kind of work, but we're also trying to rebuild together. What do we believe? What practices do we want to do together? How do we belong to each other? So I would agree with you that it can be a dangerous game to rally together just based on what you're against.
I needed to unmute my mic. Sorry about that.
A human moment. So many human moments.
So many human moments. So many things to edit. So jumping off of that question then is a very similar objection might be the biggest criticism of the evangelical right is that it is so politically aligned with one side of the political aisle. Do you see ex-vangelicalism falling prey to that on just the other end, or do you see that somehow as that not being a problem for the movement as a whole?
I think there's two ways I've heard people kind of respond to that objection, and they're quite different. One response is, yes, post-evangelical Christians, progressive Christians are also political. They just have significantly better politics than conservative Christians. I've also heard people call for, we need to be more apolitical. We need to like get out of the partisan politics. And so leveling that critique against evangelicals, but then trying to do something that isn't super partisan or political. But I'm more in the first camp, just to be honest with you. But what resonates with me is the statement that I read somewhere, probably a lot of people have said it, that the Christian faith is political, but it's not partisan. So I think if communities of faith, whether they are more on the conservative side or the more liberal side, I think if they will be guided by that, they'll at least refrain from some of the most egregious entwinements of church and state. I think that we will talk about political issues at Harbor, and you better believe it's going to be the progressive side of the issue that's going to get the airtime. But we're not talking about candidates. We're not talking about particular elections. We're talking about the issues and the theological, spiritual, and practical justice elements of those issues that might relate to our lives in some way. So I think it can be done. I think being political as a faith community is okay, but I think marrying yourself to a political party and making that your ideological lens is where I think problems probably come in.
Okay, I can go. You're doing great, by the way, John. The more that we have these in between talks, the more Steph has to edit out later. So just
Yeah, and I think you take a somewhat perverse delight in that, Jonathan, if I'm reading it right. So we can keep doing these little asides as much as we want.
yeah, it's I don't do the editing. Like he does this. um, awesome. Uh, sorry, I'm trying to figure out which to do next. So evangelicalism seems to be on this kind of rough patch in America right now. I mean, even if you're pro-evangelical, you've got to admit that this is a tumultuous time. Um, but around the world, by many counts, evangelicalism seems to be kind of growing and expanding and thriving. Why do you think that is? Both the decline here and the increase abroad.
That's a great question. I think I would just be completely just BSing you if I gave you any kind of answer. I don't have I don't have a secret knowledge about like global church trends. Um, but I will say that just to point out an obvious fact, which is that though we have some meaning for the word evangelical, we tried to trace out earlier with the Bevington quadrilateral and whatnot, the word can mean different things in different contexts and does. So if you go to Europe and someone identifies as evangelical, if you go to South America many different contexts in South America, obviously, but if you go to any one of them and someone says they're evangelical, that's going to mean something different. So I don't know exactly how united the thriving evangelical movements are in South Korea, for instance, that as they are, how related that is to US evangelicalism. I do think there are commonalities though. And I couldn't tell you exactly why things are happening the way they are on the world stage with Christianity right now, but I agree with you that it's a really rough patch for the word evangelical in the US and not so rough a patch in other places.
Switching it up a little bit, we've talked a little bit about the desire for inclusivity and just kind of perusing your website. That seems to be a really strong emphasis. My impression is that most evangelicals would say they are inclusive to an extent as well, but they would divide a line between saying they're permissive, right? You want to include the person, but not necessarily permit certain things that scripture, as they interpret it, doesn't say is okay. That you love the sinner, but you hate the sin. Anyone is welcome. Come as you are, but you need to leave change. So you hear these tropes all the time. And I'm sure you've heard those kind of cliche sentiments all the time. How might you respond to those type of sentiments?
Well, if I was being cheeky and we were in an online message thread, I would just post a link to one of our blog posts on the Harbor website. It's called what is it called? Love the believer, hate the belief, which is a play on like love the sinner, hate the sin. Basically, I think that the idea that we can love the sinner and hate the sin, like actively, verbally hate the sin in a way that actually does exclude people, even if we don't say the word exclusion, I think that's not loving. And I think to call it love is sort of hilariously misguided. And I think the church that I used to work for instance, so they would say all the things you just said, Seth, for sure. Would they include though think about queer people and black people. So queer people, they're allowed to come to the worship service, they're allowed to donate, they can do a couple volunteer roles. All the other volunteer roles are off limits to them. Staff is off limit to them. Certainly being a pastor, they would not marry them. And so if you're in a community and you are told you're not allowed to get married to the person you're partnered to that you love in that community, you're not allowed to take on any meaningful volunteer roles in that community, you're not being included. I mean, that's the literal, that is what exclusion looks like, not being allowed to fully participate in a community. And even black people. So this is a church that completely colorblind in all of its policies, all of its statements. They would never say a racist thing to their own knowledge at this church. But why were 94 of the 95 staff members white when I was hired? And the one black staff member, someone had to fight tooth and nail to get this man hired. A wonderful, distinguished pastor in the community. So hard for him to get hired. And then when he was, all the complaints that came in about his preaching style not being the same preaching style that we like to hear at this church. So then his preaching opportunities were taken away. So it's like, again, is he included? Is he welcomed? I mean, they would say he is. They hired him, but it was very hard to get him hired, and he wasn't allowed to preach as much as the white people. So I mean, it's just, I think a lot of times we think we're being inclusive but not permissive, or some such phrase. We're actually just being exclusive. And you don't understand that, though, until you can hear with an open ears and an open heart, hear the people who are being excluded as they take the risk to speak to you out of their pain and tell you the ways that your community has hurt them. And I understand it's hard to hear those things. It's very easy to get defensive, to say, well, this is why we do things the way we do them. Sorry, it's not going well for you. Maybe there's a church down the street that would meet your needs a little bit better. So thanks again to Whitfield for this religious marketplace. But anyway, sorry, I'll end my rant there. But thank you. That's an excellent question.
No, I appreciate this. And again, I risk being too pointed, so I can edit this out later if it is. But at Harbor, then, how do you balance that with also wanting to promote certain progressive values? Would you let a Trump supporter be on staff, or someone who holds to traditional marriage serve in an excessive way or teach in that capacity? How do you balance that from the other end of the political aisle?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And it's certainly something we are continuing to discern as a community. We're continuing to live out as a community. I think for us, what has been helpful is that we try not to make exclusionary decisions or policies or statements based on anything other than behavior that dehumanizes other people. Now, but that captures under it some of the things you named. So for instance, someone who says marriage can only exist between one man and one woman. We would consider verbalizing that to be something that dehumanizes the queer folks, because they're not allowed, it's not letting them participate in something that makes them fully human if they choose it, which is marriage. So that is a belief technically, but really we're not trying to police the belief. We are trying to somewhat police the speech and behavior that takes place in our community, simply as an act, I think, of protection. That's what we're trying to do. Protect the vulnerable, protect those who have been marginalized, who have been hurt, and make sure that this is not going to be a place where that happens again. Now, if you are a Trump supporter and you come to Harbor, we will welcome you. We will love you. But it will not be a place where you will feel like these are my people. I mean, that's the reality of having a group that has some identity, that has some cohesive shared values, like you said. So we can't make Harbor something where every single human being comes onto our Zoom call and feels a wonderful sense of resonance and agreement and concord. We do our best to make space for all kinds of people with all kinds of faith beliefs, political beliefs. But again, what we're trying to really keep our eye on and really draw firm boundaries around is what is said out loud in our gathering times, and making sure that there's no transphobia, no racism, no misogyny being voiced in our group gatherings.
So you must have known this question was coming. Our audience has probably been thinking it the whole time, which is, what do you do with the Bible? You're expressing sentiments about, say, homosexuality and these types of things. And everyone's, a lot of the more conservative members of our audience are thinking, but Romans 1, but this text, but that text that talks about homosexuality. Could you maybe give us a sense of what the ex-evangelical community thinks of the Bible and how the Bible is used in your community? Like, what role does it play in the community, and how might that contrast an evangelical community's approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Jonathan. I think that the answer may not feel cohesive to some of your listeners who are evangelical, but the answer is that it plays an incredibly central role in Harbor Online community. I can't speak to just ex-evangelicals everywhere, many of whom aren't Christian anymore, don't care about the Bible at all. But the progressive Christians, the post-evangelical Christians that are in my community with me, nearly every time we gather, our gathering is centered around one or more scripture readings. We look at theology that's been done about those passages, and then we have a group discussion. We go into facilitated discussion in breakout rooms about those passages and the theology. That's the main part of what we do in our weekly gathering together. So the Bible is super important to the shared life we actually have. Our time spent together is, much of it is about scripture. That the part that might not feel coherent is that most of us have just completely let go of any idea of biblical inerrancy. Essentially, it's kind of the linchpin of a lot of the belief system that we have personally just found to be really harmful to us and to some of our loved ones. And we don't feel the need to believe in biblical inerrancy. I know there's some little napkin arguments for, like, if God is wholly trustworthy and never errs, and the Bible is God's word, then how could the Bible ever err? I don't worry about those arguments. I just think the Bible is a gift. It allows us to understand God, love, life, purpose. It's a wonderful divine gift. But I do not believe in or care about biblical inerrancy. And I would say that, like, that's just my personal view of the Bible. If you polled everyone at Harbor, I think there's a wide range. Folks who love the Bible, who read it regularly, who may still have some views that are in the neighborhood of inerrancy, infallibility, that kind of thing, to folks who don't engage with it much. Maybe when they come to Harbor once a week, that's their only engagement with the Bible, and they don't care a ton about it right now. They need to kind of detox a little bit from it. So I think there's a wide range of views, but we treat it as a very important part of our faith community together, and we hold probably a range of views about it. I should also say, you mentioned that what are often called the clobber passages. These are the passages in the New Testament, especially, that seem to be talking about homosexuality. And there's 5 or 6 of them, right? And they've been called the clobber passages because they are often used to clobber queer people by telling them they are an abomination, or they're going to go to hell if they don't repent of their homosexuality or whatever. We have done studies on this together, but it's not the primary. We're not like going back over and over again to these passages and making the same arguments for why it's okay to be queer. But there's a lot of really good work out there that's been done on this. There's good documentaries, there's good books, there's good articles. There's a lot out there. We've looked at some of this as a community. And I think that, again, you might find a wide array of different ways people at Harbor view these particular verses. Some would say the Bible is a man-made document, a human-made document, and there are parts of it that just are bad, and these are the parts that are bad. And we now know that with 2,000 more years of wisdom than the people had who wrote the book. But there's other people who view this as an inspired work of God's doing, of Scripture, who would probably say something different, who would say something like, this word was never meant to be translated homosexuality. It wasn't translated that way until the mid-20th century. It actually refers to the only instances of same-sex union known at that time, which were pedophilia and temple prostitution and things of that nature, which clearly are bad. So if you can use one word to kind of capture all that stuff and condemn it, that's a very convenient way to write this letter for Paul. So there's different arguments people would adopt. But again, reflecting, I think, the wide array of views toward the Bible that we have in our community.
So immediately, someone who's listening to this is going to ask, how then do you decide theological disagreements? Let's say someone at Harbor as a different perspective than another. I feel like at least if you have some canon, something to go to, you can then at least parse out disagreements in that way. So how does Harbor and your community personally, how would you deal with these sorts of disagreements?
Well, first of all, I would say this is a problem that may seem unique to Harbor Online Community or communities like it, but I do not think it is. So how does a typical conservative evangelical independent megachurch parse out disagreements on scriptural interpretation? Either they don't, or, well, the pastor stands up on the pulpit and tells you the correct interpretation among the different options, right? It's an authoritative kind of top-down. So it's a problem no matter what, because people will read this document in different ways, as evidenced by the hundreds of denominations that exist in the US alone. At Harbor, I feel a freedom. I can disagree with someone else. So again, there's certain things we tend to agree on. Sexual ethics, at least the part of it about it not being a sin to be gay, that is widely agreed upon at Harbor. But there might be other things we don't agree on. I don't know. Even in sexual ethics, polyamory, I don't know what the different views are at Harbor. We haven't done a deep dive in that. Baptism, things that just you commonly have disagreements about. I think we would just continue to disagree. I think part of the vibe of Harbor is that difference is something that's good that we can learn from, as long as it's not actively harming or dehumanizing any of the people. So I think one thing about baptism, and you think another thing about baptism, and we disagree on it in the context of Harbor Online Community, I hope that our posture is, I'm going to learn from your perspective on this, and you are going to learn from my perspective on this. How wonderful, how mutually enriching. Now, when it comes time to make a decision, how are we going to baptize people at Harbor Online Community, if we even can, because we're a fully virtual online church? That's a whole other question. But then we have to make a decision as a community. So we have to eventually come down somewhere on certain things. But I think we embrace disagreement is the short answer to the long, rambly answer that I just gave you.
I think it's an interesting thought that, biblical inerrancy is meant to get rid of ambiguity and to give us some sort of rock bottom foundation that grounds us and isn't subjective. And you're saying, well, actually, what happens is we end up with different interpretations of what the Bible is saying that end up being settled by this person or that in the pulpit.
Exactly right.
Which is interesting because Protestantism in the Reformation was kind of intended to, let's stop disagreeing and just get back to Scripture and let that arbitrate our decisions. But actually what that ended up looking like is the thousands of different denominations that couldn't agree on what Scripture said. So I find that interesting. The concern that I can hear in a lot of our listeners' heads is, okay, you've made some good points, but once we do get away from that, how does the whole tower of cards not just topple? And my question, I guess, John, is do you still hold to things like, the bodily resurrection and the literal crucifixion and death and salvation by grace and these types of things? Like, would you still think yourself to be pretty theologically orthodox about those sort of historically primary issues? Or has the whole tower of cards toppled?
Well, okay, so the great question, and I think for many folks, the whole house of cards does topple. But I don't think the fear should be, oh no, this might all topple. I think the fear should be realizing that it's a house of cards to begin with, right? That's the concerning part to me. So once I realized my worldview, my belief system was in my own understanding, I came to realize that it was, in my opinion, a house of cards. It did kind of start to all fall. Now that's where you hear language about faith deconstruction and also faith reconstruction. So not everyone reconstructs, but that's what we're doing at Harbor. So yeah, I would say I identify as a Christian, and what I mean by that is that I believe in God and I believe in Jesus as the Son of God. I do believe he actually literally raised from the dead. And I believe that there will be a new heaven and a new earth where we will all, and by all, I mean all, like I'm a universalist, we will all be restored into a new life with God in the new heaven and new earth. But so I believe in the Trinity. I mean, I believe in like many Orthodox Christian beliefs. But that being said, what I now mean when I say I believe those things is very different from what I meant when I was an evangelical. So I actually hold a lot of the same beliefs, but I hold them very differently. So belief for me used to mean that I find within me, or I try to drum up within me, a certain strong, rational agreement with a truth proposition. So like if someone says, are we going to go to heaven when we die? I would say, do I confidently, strongly believe that I or other people will go to heaven when we die? If I find that, yes, I have a strength of conviction within me, then yes, I believe that. If I don't, then no, I don't. Now I'm like, I don't have a strength of conviction in any of this stuff. I don't, when I look inside me, say like, is there a Trinitarian God? I cannot find like a rational, convinced, confident part of me to just step in and say, yes, but I want to believe. And so I choose to believe that all these things I believe are true. It's a bit like Schrodinger. I've never known how to say the guy's name, but his cat. It's kind of like that, right? I actually don't know. I can't know if the metaphysical, hidden, invisible things are true, but gosh, I want them to be. And I'm going to choose to believe them and choose to live my life as if they were true. That's now what I mean by belief. So yeah, I would say I am a Christian in some Orthodox sense of the word, but I also don't speak for everyone at Harbor Online Community. So that's just my personal view of things.
Hopefully the cat is alive, and if it's dead, it hopefully resurrects. Either way.
That's right. That cat will be with us in the new heaven and new earth, we hope.
It's a good thing you said universalism, you know.
Yeah.
There'll be the dead and the alive cat will be there together.
All possible cats.
They'll all be alive again. The box
all
will be there too. The whole thing. It's all there.
The entire quantum superstate will be actualized. There we go.
At the end of all things, the dogs will lie down with the cats and the lions with the lambs, and ex-vangelical with evangelicals, dare I say?
That's what I'm hoping for.
Okay.
Jon, thank you so much for this really awesome, interesting conversation. You're a great person to interview. You just rattle things off and you do it so quickly. But one final question I want to throw your way, which is you probably, over the past few years with the popularity of ex-vangelicals, have generated a lot of misconceptions. I'm just curious, what are some of the most frustrating and wrong ones that you've come across?
Wow. Well, again, ex-vangelicalism, broadly speaking, is so diffuse and so all over the place that anything said about ex-vangelicals is probably true of some of them. So I don't think anything's a total misconception when it comes to just ex-vangelicals. But yeah, having a faith community, though, that's post-evangelical in nature, we get all kinds of hate online. And most of it is that we're false prophets, we're heretics, we're going to hell, we're bringing other people to hell. We don't care about Jesus. Some of these are just convictions people have. I can't talk them out of it. I have another cheeky blog post that I often drop on people called we don't mind when you call us heretics. Just to let people know, like, you're not bothering us. If anything, you are strengthening our resolve to keep doing what we're doing. Because if you're hopping on comment sections telling people they're going to hell, what makes you think we want to be part of your religious club? That's why we got out of it. But no, in terms of misconceptions, I think a lot of my evangelical, I still have friends and family, more so friends, but I still have a lot of contacts who participate in evangelical Christianity. And I think what is hurtful and what's sad is just when they express their sort of condescending concern for my well-being. And I get it. Like I am critical. I'm very critical of evangelical Christianity in my blog posts, in my social media posts. So I'm sure I'm offending them regularly, but just the condescension, I'm worried about your soul. And like, do you still love Jesus? And like, there's this sense that if you leave evangelical Christianity, you must just be going off the deep end. You're just full heathen mode. Like it's just, you don't have any meaningful faith anymore. Either you lost your salvation or you never had it based on people's convictions on that sort of thing. But I just would want to tell people everyone's on their own journey and everyone has the agency to actually figure out what the right next step is for their own journey. So if you have a loved one who used to be evangelical and now they're not anymore, certainly talk to them, ask them questions, definitely engage in conversations about it. But I don't think there's any need to wring your hands or to try to, guilt trip them back into the fold. I think just let them be on their journey and just love them and ask them good questions. And that would be my advice in terms of misconceptions about post-evangelicals.
Jon Mathieu, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Seth and Jonathan. It was great to be here.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
Thanks, man. I think that went really great. We weren't trying to have a gotcha moment, but I think these conversations are just so much better when we give you hard questions and you knock them out of the park. And I felt like you did really well.
Oh, thank you. I mean, you sent me the questions ahead of time, so I didn't feel like surprised or
that's why we do it.
You were trying to trap me or anything. So thank you. And Jonathan, I know when we spoke briefly at AAR, I kind of knew that the audience was sort of evangelical, but I didn't necessarily know it to the extent that you communicated it during that interview. So I'm certainly curious how your listeners will find our discussion. I should have probably thrown in some generic disclaimer like evangelical Christian are still wonderful people. They're beautiful. They have value. I love them. Something like that. So
the recording's still going. I'll throw that at the beginning.
Just jam that in that empty space we had earlier.
Yeah. You can say we leave it recording now specifically because a lot of the best stuff comes out in this after thing where we're just sort of joking around. Hopefully we
gotta do an outtakes episode too.
Here's the thing: we do if evangelical, we offend everyone. We did aliens. We had an ex-evangelical who became a Catholic. So yeah, we had a whole where he basically gave an apologetic for Catholicism.
Yeah, they always do. It's always about the Eucharist. I never get it. It doesn't make any sense to me, but
I wouldn't say we're solely evangelical, but I think a good portion of our listeners have been in that camp, and so.
So, Jonathan, I know you're like a Cambridge-trained philosopher, but Seth, I don't actually think I know your background. What do you do, or what is your background?
He just went to Oxford, so he doesn't. That doesn't count.
Probably rivals, right? You guys have Sharks versus Jets street fights or something.
In the way that
imply some sort of equality to be a rival,
and he's like a mouse to a cat. That's the rivalry? So.
John, you're interrupting me. Did they teach you no manners at Cambridge?
Sorry, I don't acknowledge you as worthy of speech. In group, out group.
So I did a master's in science and religion at Oxford, and I'm finishing a PhD in theology at Durham now.
Nice, very cool.
Yeah,
I had a friend who got his doctorate at Durham, something in New Testament, but
that's the place to do it.
Nice.
For New Testament, yeah.
Yeah, and Jonathan, you're teaching at some school in the Midwest.
Yeah, I'm at Lincoln Christian University, which is very evangelical.
Nice. Well, I thought this was good, and edit it however you want. I mean, it's your podcast, so just I trust you with the editing, but.
Oh yeah, we're
absolutely. Basically, the only thing that's going to get edited is stuff you asked for, and is to make it sound good. Cool. Basically, it's just to make it sound.
Yeah, we're not making you sound like Hitler here.
Yeah.
And if you were, even if you did, I'm sure you'd have a shocking number of fans anyway, which is.
Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, please consider subscribing and leaving us a 5-star review. We're an up-and-coming podcast, and every little bit helps. Also consider joining our Patreon page. Patreon sponsors have exclusive access to unaired episodes, different kinds of merchandise, the ability to suggest an episode, and even an hour-long interview with Jonathan and I. Check it out at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com and see what you're missing out on. Sound effects from Zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.